I don't really care for J.K. Rowling, unfortunately, because the comments that she's made I don't agree with.
Someone like her, she really is just truly at the heart bigoted, hiding in this, sheep's costume, pretending that she is an ally.
I really wish this was not the hill she chose to die on.
I'm Andy Mills.
I'm Megan Phelps-Roper.
You're listening to Reflector. And today we continue our exploration into the state of difficult public debates 1 year after the release of our series, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling.
Back in our initial reporting for the show, we spoke to many people who were critical of J.K. Rowling and the coalition on the political left that she had come to represent. Some saw her as dangerously misinformed. Some saw her as the face of contemporary bigotry. Others were confused as to why she, of all people, would use her fame and platform to speak up on this, of all issues.
She's basically used her platform more often than not to do trans bashing. So it's like really devastating that an author like that's this influential is also like this obsessively devoted to contributing to the persecution of this group of people who's already so harassed.
I think to have the author of these beautiful, loving, accepting stories hurting marginalized communities, it sucks.
Yeah, she's super transphobic. She's a TERF. She's pretty terrible.
What would you say to her if she were listening?
It's just, God, why?
While some of her critics had publicly shamed Rowling and attempted to remove her voice from the public discourse, others were still holding out some degree of hope that over time, some sort of reconciliation or greater understanding was possible. And among those was a diehard Harry Potter fan and transgender teenager named Noah.
I want to look back on this in 10 years and be like, remember when everyone thought that J.K. Rowling was transphobic? And then there was that big dialogue where she, something said something and didn't abandon her original concerns. But I guess I want to say I hope that this is a blip on her legacy. And I guess I want people to be able to identify her as having good intentions.
And then there was the award-winning online commentator, Natalie Wynn, who, while she held out far less hope than Noah, and was far more critical of Rowling, did end our conversation with a moving plea for Rowling to see where trans critics like her were coming from.
I just kind of hope she could try to see why so many trans people are angry and hurt by this. And I realize that means asking for a second to leave her own position of feeling hurt and threatened. But that's what she says that she wants to do.
The last time we had the chance to sit down with Rowling for the series, we asked her to speak directly to her critics and to address their concerns. This is a small sample of what she had to say.
I would say to them, you, as a human being, the self that you are, I have the utmost respect for you. I want you protected. I want you safe. I would treat you with respect, always. And I would say, I'm worried. I'm worried that you, yourself, may have got caught up in something that may ultimately harm you. But I'm asking some questions because I think some vulnerable groups are being harmed. And that includes the gay community, that includes vulnerable women, and it includes vulnerable youth. Now, if you identify as trans, if that is an answer for you, then I'm with you 100%. But we are seeing mounting evidence that this is not the answer for everyone, and that we may be living through a cultural moment that we will look back on, not with pride, but with puzzlement that we let it happen.
For today, Megan and I follow up with some of Rowling's critics, and we see what they make of the public conversation around sex and gender, what they make of J.K. Rowling, and what they make of one of the ideas at the heart of our series, that good faith debates are necessary for creating a better society. And first up, is Jacob.
Jacob, can we start with you just introducing yourself to listeners?
Sure. My name is Jacob Tobia. I am a writer, author of Sissy, a coming-of-gender story, and a TV writer and producer also.
Jacob identifies as transgender and non-binary and uses they/them pronouns. They published their book Sissy in 2019 and has been named as one of Forbes 30 Under 30 and listed as one of the most influential LGBTQ+ people by Out magazine. Last year, Jacob wrote me an email, and we sat down to talk.
And can you tell the story of how you came to hear that J.K. Rowling had read your book?
Yes, I remember it very vividly. It was a Saturday morning and woke up to a text from one of my friends who's an editor in New York. And she was like, "Did you listen to that new J.K. Rowling podcast? J.K. Rowling talks about your book." And I was just like, wait, pause. And so I listened to the episode.
I did what I always tend to do when in that situation. So I read a ton of books.
Found the part
Jacob Tobia's Sissy,
where she talks about having read Jacob Tobia's Sissy.
You're trying to have your views challenged.
Completely, because I really want to understand what is the thinking through personal experience, but also the philosophy, the idea.
And honestly, I feel like my soul, a part of it just kind of fell out of my body. Because on one level, it was this, my 5th grade self was screaming with joy about who in the world would have ever thought that, J.K. Rowling would have read my book, the woman who wrote Harry Potter, which I was a huge Potterhead growing up, would have read it. My inner child was just giddy. And then my adult mind was wow, this is incredibly complicated.
And so you had also, it sounds like, been following the controversy around her over the last few years.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you can't not have heard about it if you're part of the trans or non-binary community. It was everywhere. And, I weighed in at various points during the whole thing.
Do you remember what you said?
Oh, goodness. I'm pretty sure I said something about, how, in general, this questioning of the womanhood of trans women, making that publicly acceptable, right? This sort of public interrogation of the womanhood of trans women is exactly what we face from the people who assault and murder us as trans people in public, right? This feeling of walking around and having someone look at you and wonder if you're quote unquote a real woman and then becoming violent toward you. Mm-hmm. That is something that gender nonconforming people and trans women have experienced for a very long time.
So it's safe to say that you felt that Rowling was contributing to this further endangering of trans people, and you wanted to speak out against what she was saying publicly.
Right.
Jacob says that after hearing that episode where Rowling mentioned their book, they went back and started our series from the beginning.
So I had the idea for Potter on a train when I was 25.
I had not heard about the details of J.K. Rowling's experience as a survivor of domestic violence and of abuse.
The situation was a bad situation, but until you actually go through it, you don't know what you would choose to do.
And I had not known much about her ex-husband and just how much in danger she felt because of him.
There came a night where he became very angry with me, and I cracked, and I said, I want to go, I want to leave. And he became very violent, and he said, if you're leaving, you can leave, but you're not getting Jessica. I'm keeping her. I will hide her.
Hearing the part about how she had to take the pages of Harry Potter that she had written in longhand into the office.
When I realized that I was definitely going to go, I would take a few pages of the manuscript into work every day, just a few pages so he wouldn't realize anything was missing, and I would photocopy.
Day by day, bit by bit, and photocopy them because she was worried that if she ever told her husband she was going to leave, that he would burn the manuscript.
Because I suspected that if I wasn't able to get out with everything, he would burn it or take it or hold it hostage.
I mean, I got misty-eyed, right? I'm verklempt right now thinking about it, because to me, that level of fear, I mean, that is so deep, right? Like that trauma is in your bones and it doesn't go anywhere. It stays in your bones for the rest of your life.
Jacob told me that in listening to Rowling's story, it became clear that she was not just some famous author, but someone who had been shaped by her experiences, many of which were undeniably tied to being a woman.
And so on the one hand, I'm holding that experience of hers, and then also holding my own experience as a, non-binary person, as a gender nonconforming person who navigates the world in a very visibly gender nonconforming way.
And Jacob saw a bridge to their own experiences. Back when they first moved from North Carolina to New York City and started navigating the subway system every day, they began to feel vulnerable to attacks, hyper-aware of every sideways glance, every double take, as a possible threat.
The feeling of standing on a subway platform late at night in a skirt, regretting that you don't have a big coat to cover up, seeing some man standing at the other end of the subway platform who's clearly noticed you and is sort of following you and wondering, is this the man that kills me? Every time I wore a dress, I just was like, maybe today is the day that someone pushes me onto the subway tracks or in front of a train. Maybe today is the day that someone breaks my jaw.
You feel exposed and vulnerable.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, it was like this walking nightmare of the abuse of men.
It sounds like a similar, like you understand when she is talking about, the kind of experiences that make a lot of women fearful of men. You share some of those fears, it sounds like.
Yeah, because men, not all men, but many men treat femininity with violence regardless of which body is inhabiting it. And all you have to do to understand the degree to which it doesn't matter whether or not you were in a female or a male body is have a penis and wear a dress for a day.
Mm-hmm. And so, well, it sounds like you still think she is wrong in her public statements and, you stand by your condemnation of those statements. Hearing her story more fully meant something to you.
Yeah, it certainly shattered this idea that I had that, she as a human being was some immovable edifice, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt, and maybe I'm naive, but I felt some slight glimmer of possibility that maybe there is a way through this whole conversation, that maybe there is a way we can get to know one another more radically, and that maybe this rift doesn't have to be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, how can I contribute to this conversation? Because it just feels like our traumas are butting up against each other, and the most traumatized folks from both of our communities just got online and then started yelling at each other, and it turned into something, this abominable problem that, I don't know if we have the feminist bandwidth to be wasting our time with. I feel like there are so many bigger fish to fry right now, and I really would like for us to find some way for people to be like, okay, I get it now.
In Jacob's email to me, they wrote that when they look at the toxic nature of the online dialogue, mostly what they see is pain, and that they were feeling more and more drawn to finding a way to repair what had been broken.
I think that we can be more productive in how we have the conversation. I think we have to sit down with one another and say, these are the experiences that are informing how I understand this. This is the fear that is motivating the intensity of my feeling.
Mm-hmm. You also wrote toward the end of your email, I believe finding agreement and breaking down these walls is worthwhile. It would do my heart good. And that was really interesting to me because when I talk about the importance of good faith conversation, some people think I'm just advocating that for people who were like I was, people who are seen as bigots. But to my mind, it's just a very practical and helpful thing to do, both because I think it is, the most persuasive way of reaching somebody and achieving, finding some way forward, but also because it's not just for the benefit of whoever our opponent is, because we all benefit when we have those conversations in a way that helps us find that way forward.
Yeah, what it boils down to for me is that I don't want to participate in any movement or institution or anything that treats any human being as if they are disposable. No human being is disposable. And that is really painful sometimes, and it is terrifying sometimes. And I am beyond afraid that even talking to you for this podcast, there are going to be people who are going to say that I don't care enough about the trans community, or I'm gonna have messed up my words once, or said something that out of context doesn't sound perfect, right? Like, I'm terrified to be sitting with you saying these things. You saw how nervous I was before we sat down, because trying to remind everybody that no one is disposable is a monumental task.
Our rights are no debate. Our rights are no debate. Our rights are no.
Jacob says that they understand why people want to police the boundaries of this debate, but they think that the time has come for advocates like them and feminists like Rowling to get together in a room without microphones or cameras and just talk.
I think that this conversation, we need to be having it face to face in a spirit of compassion. And I know that sounds naive for today's day and age, but I'm like, is it any surprise that expressing a small hesitation on Twitter then turns into a gargantuan debate about the existential nature of humanity, right? Like, this forum is not built for actual growth of movements. And so we got to get it off of there. Like, assuming that you're coming to the table in other important ways and that, like, you really do just have actual questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm down to talk. People assume that we have some apparatus where we all get together to have these conversations person to person. And we don't.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone wants to. I'm not signing up the whole movement here, but, like, I think we should sit down.
Jacob Tobia, thank you so much for sharing that with me and for speaking with me today.
It has been terrifying and delightful to talk to you.
We recorded that conversation between Jacob and Megan last summer, and so to get a sense of where things stand now, this week, we called Jacob back.
I don't know. The whole thing's been really disappointing, frankly. So I stick by what I said when we last spoke, which is I am never going to be the type of person who, or at least I'm going to do my best as a human being to not see other people as disposable, right? Like, I don't want to act like anyone is ever beyond the ability to learn, or that, like, I'm ever going to decide, you know, this person is not worth having a conversation with or not worth getting to know.
Jacob says that while they stand by what they said, and they do see signs that the discourse is getting better, it has gotten a lot more complicated when it comes to J.K. Rowling.
It's just like, you know, a year later, the feeling is very much like womp womp. She's gotten worse. She's being more annoying. And also just like her discourse is getting weirder and more unhinged. It's like, girl, are you okay?
Recently, Jacob and others have renewed their public criticism of J.K. Rowling as she has continued to weigh in on this debate on social media, and doing so in a way that her supporters tend to think of as snarky and funny, but her detractors see as vulgar and crass.
And a prime example of this can be seen in her viral Twitter thread from April 1st of this year, in what Rowling referred to as the mother of all April Fool's jokes.
A controversial new law aimed at cracking down on hate speech is now in effect in Scotland. The Hate Crime and Public Order Act creates a new crime of, quote, stirring up hatred related to age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity.
At the time, Rowling's home country of Scotland passed this new controversial hate crime bill.
The bill aims to simplify existing hate crime laws in Scotland while extending an offence of stirring up hatred.
It criminalises threatening behaviour based on age, disability, sexual orientation and transgender identity.
The stated aim of the law was to provide greater protection for some marginalized communities, including transgender people. But immediately, critics came out in force against it and its vague language of, quote, stirring up hatred.
The bill has been criticised from some quarters over its perceived threat to free speech.
The government has only got one chance to get this right, and if they get it wrong, innocent people are going to be convicted of a hate crime.
Many worried that this was an attack on free speech, and they said that this law risked criminalizing aspects of the very debate around sex and gender that had recently been opening up. And the most high-profile critic of this new law was J.K. Rowling.
The Harry Potter author says the new laws are wide open to abuse and challenged the police to arrest her.
On April 1st, the day that the law went into effect, Rowling went online and, in a faux jolly tone, tweeted about Isla Bryson, the convicted rapist who had transitioned after her criminal investigation began. She called Isla, quote, a lovely lass, and urged all to respect Isla's pronouns. She then wrote about another trans woman who had been convicted for possession of child pornography. Rowling tweeted that, she's still a lady to me. Rowling continued on like this, highlighting some trans women who had been convicted as criminals, some who were competing in women's sports leagues, some who had been appointed to United Nations women's organizations, and then she wrote, quote, April Fools. Obviously, the people mentioned in the above tweets are not women at all, but men. And then, in a direct challenge to her government, she wrote, it is impossible to accurately describe or tackle the reality of violence and sexual violence committed against women and girls unless we are allowed to call a man a man. She wrote that she was currently out of the country, but that if her tweets had been a violation of this new law, then, quote, I look forward to being arrested when I return to the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment.
The Harry Potter author took to social media daring police to arrest her yesterday after new hate crime laws came into effect in Scotland. Detectives say the comments are not criminal.
And after these tweets went viral, the Scottish police came out and clarified that they were not going to arrest J.K. Rowling.
And that seemed to be a primary goal of her posts, to push the government to provide clarity on a law that many saw as overly vague, to force them to acknowledge that the law could not be used against Scottish citizens who misgender trans people. Rowling even announced that, quote, if they go after any woman for simply calling a man, I'll repeat that woman's words, and they can charge us both at once. But since then, public response has been polarized.
On the one hand, many have cheered Rowling for her willingness to be a lightning rod on this issue, drawing fire to herself to protect the free speech rights of those who lack her resources or her fame. And in the most recent polling, a majority of the Scottish public now say that they do not support this new law. But on the other hand, it's exactly comments like these that have led people like Jacob to lose hope.
Twitter is dead. It's only X. There is no such thing as Twitter anymore. It's become a far-right microphone.
Jacob says that the more that Rowling tweets like this, the more it appears that this window of possibility is closing. And the only way forward is to get offline and into the flesh and blood of the real world.
If you're going to say that you want to learn, you're going to say that you care about people like us, if you want to say you care about gender nonconforming kids and gender equality and stuff, like, you got to sit down with folks. And it's okay if you're not choosing me to sit down with, right? If you don't want to, like, I don't need to be the emissary, but you got to sit down with somebody. You have to actually sit down for the conversation.
After a short break, we'll hear from two thoughtful critics of J.K. Rowling, who were both featured prominently in our original series. Noah, a teenager who shared the moving story of his transition, and Natalie, who, after listening to our show, has become an outspoken critic of ours. Stay with us.
Hello, this is Matt with Reflector, and this episode is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is one of the most helpful tools that I use every day to navigate the echo chambers and media bias plaguing our world. Here's an example of what I mean. Back in January, pro-Palestinian protesters gathered outside the White House to call for a ceasefire.
Tense moments at the White House overnight. Pro-Palestinian protesters broke through a temporary gate.
The protest eventually became violent, and some White House staff nearby were evacuated.
Washington, D.C.'s police chief says things were thrown at cops. Riot police were trying to stop the crowd.
Now, when I came across the story on the Ground News app, they had done this great service where I could swipe between the headlines to see how different media outlets described the same story. So I would see NPR's headline, "Pro-Palestinian demonstrators in D.C. march to demand ceasefire in Gaza." Next to The Messenger's headline, "Pro-Palestinian protesters damage fence outside White House, forcing evacuation of nearby staff." Right next to The Blaze's headline, "Palestinian supporters tried to breach White House fencing, rioters attack officers, staffers relocated, no arrests." Ground News helps me not just learn about a single news item, but also see that news in the context of the larger media world. Now, whether you're on the political left or on the political right, or like a lot of people these days, you don't really know where you fit in, we can all agree that it's hard to trust what you see in the news and on your phones and in your social media feeds. Ground News cares about this problem, and they're working to help. On top of showing different headlines, they offer blind spot reports to show you stories outside your bubble. They collect local reporting on the city or the town that you live in, and they rate news stories and outlets on their level of bias. I really think that if you like this podcast, you would like their mission. To go check them out, use the link ground.news/reflector. That's ground.news/reflector, and you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. We appreciate what they're up to. We appreciate their support of this podcast, so go check them out. And make sure you use our link, ground.news/reflector, so they know that we sent you. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome back. We now want to turn to the views of one especially vocal critic, not only of J.K. Rowling, but of our work as well.
Last year, I agreed to be a guest on a podcast about J.K. Rowling, hosted by Megan Phelps Roper, an escapee from the Westboro Baptist Church, the notorious hate group from Topeka, Kansas, most known for protesting the funerals of soldiers with signs that say God hates God and me both.
Natalie Wynn is a trans woman and a popular YouTuber who goes by the name Contrapoints.
I liked the idea that this famous former bigot could talk some sense into a famous current bigot. We all love a good redemption arc.
And she was also one of our favorite interviews for the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling.
And that was in part because of her passionate critique of Rowling, but it was also in part because she herself was the subject of an intense public shaming online by some of the very same people who had publicly shamed Rowling and other feminists. Here's just an excerpt of her speaking about that from our original interview.
I've been doxxed, I've been swatted, I've received death threats, mutilation threats, any kind of terrible online behavior you can imagine, I've been the target of.
And so Natalie was in this great position to help us understand two powerful things. First, what Rowling might be experiencing amidst intense personal attacks from people who she usually thought of as her political allies.
Yeah, it's kind of easier to dismiss hateful bigots because it's like, well, whatever, like they're going to hate me regardless. But when it's from people whose like political side that you're supposedly aligned with and from people who share your identity, and they're the ones who are really coming at you the hardest, like, yeah, it's painful.
But also, she was able to help us get a better sense of exactly what was motivating some of these critics and the intense way that they were responding to Rowling.
When you feel downtrodden and you feel abused and you feel humiliated, there's a vindictive impulse. You want revenge, not just justice. That's aggression in search of a target. But often the person that we take revenge against is not really the person who's responsible, but rather they are a symbol of all the pain that we feel.
However, shortly after we announced the series, before we had published any episodes, Natalie went on Twitter and wrote that her participation in our show had been, quote, a serious lapse in judgment. And then, a few weeks after our last episode, Natalie released a new video essay in which she critiques our podcast for almost 2 hours.
My wishful thinking was that because Megan left Westboro, that must mean that she must understand the intricacies of anti-LGBT bigotry. My hope was that Megan would act as the trans ally and could be really effective at confronting Joro about all the transphobic stuff she says, right? Wrong.
And while Natalie has not responded to our invitations to come and speak with us again, in this video that she released, she does say a lot about her views. Not only about Rowling and about us, but also about the state and the purpose of public debates more broadly. And so Megan and I wanted to do our best to hear where she's coming from, to respond in good faith to her critiques, and to do our part to embody our belief in engaging in difficult public debates. And so, Megan, I think we should start off with what I think is one of her strongest points, which is this idea that you, because of your past, you have a blind spot that other people don't have when it comes to bigotry.
So Megan Phelps Roper's viewpoint seems to be that scorn and condemnation are never appropriate, that we should approach every conflict with empathy and compassion, even when dealing with the worst, most destructive people in the world.
She says in the video that because of your background at Westboro, you have a heightened capacity to sympathize with bigots.
And I get why Megan thinks this, right? De-radicalization was a really important part of her life experience. She's also clearly holding out hope that other members of her family will leave Westboro and have a life on the outside. She has a quote from her mom in her Twitter bio. The last lines of her book address her family. "I want to tell them that I love them. I'll just have to find another way." This is touching and human and also kind of a conflict of interest.
And that because members of your family are still predominantly a part of this church, and because you love them and you hope to have a relationship with them again one day, that you are more invested in the future well-being of bigots and are unable to truly empathize with the victims of bigotry.
The problem is, Megan's views about this only make sense if you assume that Megan is the main character of reality. If you assume that the moral improvement of bigots is more important than protecting the people they target. Or if you assume that changing bigots' minds is the only way to make social progress, which it isn't.
What do you think about that?
I can definitely see where she's coming from. I do see it as part of my mission to tell people that even those of us who have done or said even some of the most aggressively bigoted things, that we are not monsters, we are human beings with human flaws, and that change is possible. And yeah, of course, I do love my family, and I would love to have a relationship with them again. Not contingent on me engaging in bigotry, but absolutely, I love them. I miss them. But I also just totally disagree that my empathy for people like my family means that I have a diminished capacity to understand the harm done to bigotry's victims. I don't think compassion is a zero-sum game. And while the beliefs of my upbringing were unraveling for me, I became deeply disturbed by the way that my family and I were dehumanizing people and celebrating their suffering. So right after I left the church, I really started to actively seek out community with people that we used to target. LGBT people, Jewish people, atheists, other Christians, people in the military. Because I didn't want those barriers that I had spent my whole life erecting to just stay there forever. I wanted to meet people where they were. I wanted to understand them and their experiences and not to write them off the way that I had done all those years at the church. And I will just say that after 10 years of that, it's now the outsider perspective that feels intuitive to me rather than the old Westboro one. And so when I see these old videos of myself, it's really hard not to just break down crying sometimes at I want to say inhuman things that we did, but,
that's the thing about your story, is that they were human.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, when I look at those videos now, I intuitively think about the fact that our targets, they were someone's child, someone's mother or brother or sister or friend. And so when I talk about the importance of conversation and persuasion, it's not because I'm trying to center bigots at the expense of their targets. It's because when you persuade someone who is doing harm to stop doing harm, they are not the only people who benefit. Everyone they were targeting benefits. Everyone that they would have targeted in the future benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that as kind of turning off the spigot of bigotry. I mean, if you will. It's like if you imagine this, for some reason, I don't know why this analogy came to me, but like I was talking to a friend, we were having this exact conversation because he also is a former bigot. And as he's describing this idea of simply focusing on the victims of bigotry, I just got this mental image of a fire hose that's blasting out water and nobody's even holding it. It's just like, and then you have people who are like trying to hold an umbrella over the people who are getting wet rather than like going and turning off
the spigot,
the hose. Exactly. Turn it off. Turn off this thing that is hurting so many people, rather than just trying to find a way of like containing the damage.
I think that's a great metaphor.
There's different tactics, in other words. Like you can do both. You can do the thing to protect the people who are being harmed, and you can try to stop other people from being victims now and in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I understand where Natalie's coming from, but I don't think we're at risk of spending too much time persuading bigots. I don't think that's a really common strategy.
And of course, this entire thing gets a lot more complicated when you add to it the question of whether or not J.K. Rowling and her views are bigoted, or whether, as some people say, the accusation of bigotry is better understood as a way to attempt to remove Rowling from the public conversation more broadly.
Right. And like Helen Lewis said, most people at this point are not convinced that J.K. Rowling is a bigot. So if you want them to change their views, you have to understand what it is that she's arguing so that you can argue against it.
Well, this actually leads really well into another point that Natalie makes that I think is worth wrestling with. In her video, she spends a lot of time telling the story of a woman named Anita Bryant.
Anita Bryant is a native Oklahoman who once had a career as a pop singer, beauty queen, and spokeswoman for the Florida Citrus Commission.
According to the Word of God, it's an abomination to practice homosexuality.
Bryant was this famous figure back in the 1970s who used her celebrity to become an outspoken voice against the normalization of gay people in society.
As long as they don't want to flaunt their homosexuality, they have equal rights the same as anyone else.
And in her video, Natalie compares our attempts to understand Rowling in her nuance to the idea that we could have done the exact same thing with Bryant.
Isn't it cruel, even, to slur Anita as a bigot and a homophobe? In fact, isn't it possible that Anita Bryant was the real victim? Oh no. Oh no!
She actually makes fun of us in this way that I think is truly funny and says, "This is the Witch Trials of Anita Bryant."
The Witch Trials of Anita Bryant. God help us all. The mainstream media would have us believe that Anita Bryant is a so-called homophobe, some kind of hateful bigot. But isn't this just an authoritarian tactic used to silence valid concerns? Mothers in this country are worried about their children going to school to be taught by perverts. How can we be so sure that the militant homosexuals weren't the real bigots? Isn't it possible?
And to make her case, Natalie points to the fact that a lot of gay rights activists back in the 1970s attacked Bryant in very similar ways to how critics today are attacking Rowling.
Gay activists routinely compared Anita to Adolf H. They blamed her for hate crimes. They burned her in effigy. They disrupted events she was involved in.
They similarly sent Bryant death threats. They similarly called her names like whore. They tried to shut down her public speaking events. They took pictures of her face and they superimposed them on images of graphic sex, and they sent that to her house.
See, this is how you canceled people before phones. The harassment escalated to the point where Anita had to cancel her book tour due to demonstrations and bomb threats from gay activists. And of course, there was the pie.
And in this one now famous scene, because it was televised,
and went into a place called Norfolk, Virginia.
a group of activists showed up and threw a pie in Anita Bryant's face.
And
Security agent. No, let him stay.
And what Natalie says is that if she were doing what she accuses us of doing, then she would focus all on Anita's nuanced backstory and try and understand her better.
Anita Bryant lived a difficult life. In 1940, she was born into brutal poverty in rural Oklahoma. Her parents divorced when she was just 2 years old, the same year she made her singing debut at the Baptist church. Her father abandoned the family again when she was 12.
It was real painful, and it just about killed my mother. She was a very submissive wife. She was too submissive, and it angered me.
She goes through how Anita Bryant had a really rough background, how she was abused, had a really tough relationship with men generally.
In 1960, Anita married Bob Green, Miami's top disc jockey. Green was allegedly a controlling and abusive husband, and Anita rationalized the abuse, saying,
"Despite our sometimes violent scraps, I love him for it."
But while submitting to her husband and raising 4 children, Anita was still able to build the career she'd always wanted. By the 1970s,
and she says that in a way you could twist history to make it seem like Anita Bryant was the real victim in this situation, the same way that she claims you and I were trying to paint Rowling as the real victim in our podcast.
Mm-hmm. Look, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's possible to take genuine virtues like nuance, empathy, and impartiality and to twist them into fucked up apologia for horrible oppressive behavior. If you play this game long enough, you can essentially explain away the entire concept of bigotry and conclude that, in reality, there are no bigots. There's only tragically misunderstood people with difficult childhoods and valid concerns.
And Megan, I wondered what you made of this, besides the obvious fact that I think we should state here that Anita Bryant believed that being gay is immoral, and J.K. Rowling is a champion of gay rights and thinks that being gay or trans is a perfectly valid way to live your life. What do you make, though, of this comparison and this critique?
Well, Natalie seemed to be mocking the idea that anyone would care where Anita Bryant's views came from. And one of the things I was thinking about as I watched Natalie's video was that Anita Bryant's backstory is actually really interesting to me.
No, I had the exact same thought while I was watching it. I kept thinking, hang on, Natalie, are you really not interested in this backstory? You're doing a really good job of bringing me into it. I wonder if in some ways this could come down to a matter of taste. I just know that I personally am drawn towards trying to understand why anyone believes anything that they believe.
Yeah, I mean, and even just from a very practical perspective, it seems really useful to understand where someone is coming from if you are going to persuasively argue against them in their position.
Right.
And, I think that's where I had a real disconnect with Natalie's critique. For me, a lot of our disagreement comes down to this one line that she says in the video, which is something like, Anita Bryant didn't need to be persuaded. She needed to be defeated.
As far as I know, Anita Bryant is 83 years old, and she's still homophobic. But even without Anita's blessing, gay rights have still somehow managed to progress since the 1970s. Because gay activists didn't need to persuade Anita Bryant. They needed to defeat her.
And my first thought was like, wait, but what does it mean for Anita Bryant to be defeated? Like, doesn't it mean for her ideas to be defeated? Which is just another way of saying we have to persuade people that Anita Bryant's ideas are wrong. And I don't think a pie in the face or threats of violence are the things that defeated Anita Bryant. It was gay people coming out to their family and friends and having these conversations where they showed that the mainstream opinions about them being sinful and dangerous and bad for children were just wrong. And the thing is, Natalie actually says this in episode 6. She said something like, well, I think that realistically, that is the trajectory. That is how acceptance happens.
Well, I think that realistically, that is how acceptance that is the trajectory. Like, I'm not under any illusions about what it's going to take for trans people to be accepted. I think that we're
you know, she said herself, like, I certainly do believe in having the conversation. I think I'm having the conversation right now.
I certainly do believe in having the conversation. I mean, I consider myself, I think I'm having the conversation right now.
Yeah, I think that as somebody who has watched a lot of Natalie's videos over the course of many years, one of my critiques of this video is just that Natalie didn't mention any of the views that she espoused when she was a guest on our podcast in her critique of that podcast. She didn't wrestle with the fact that some of the things that she was saying now were in contradiction to things that she had said in the video in a way that at times made it hard to follow. But I do think that if we're being generous, which I know that we want to be, I think part of what she's trying to say is that you, Megan, seem to be against being rude to people, boycotting people, doing anything that might be called, quote unquote, canceling someone.
Is canceling ever warranted? Is it right to condemn racism, homophobia, and misogyny? Or should we allow spokespeople for these prejudices a respected position in the free marketplace of ideas, where we can all sit around debating the legitimacy of gay marriage or the possible merits of a white ethno-state? Is the final solution a myth?
And in part of the video, she says, almost directly to you, is there just no room in society to shame bigots?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you know, in some sense, she seems to be arguing with a position that I don't actually hold. So at one point she said something like, what Megan means is that we should never say mean things to bigots. And that's absolutely not an argument that I've ever made. I don't say that people should never mock bigots. And I don't shame people for mocking bigots or boycotting or counter-protesting or anything like that. I just say that I don't think it's as effective if you want to change someone's mind.
Right.
So I'm actually not sure that we disagree in the way that she seems to be implying in the video. It seems like she's setting us up as being at odds on this point, but I actually don't think that we are. I just don't have that position.
Yeah, and I do see this in a similar way when she talks in the video about violence.
Like, people forget this, maybe because they were called suffragettes, which is kind of a cutesy name, but the suffragettes, they murdered people. They were suffragette terrorists. They broke windows, they bombed churches, they set fire to a theater. And my point is not to advocate terrorism or to excuse the terrorism of past movements. I think these kinds of tactics have tended to turn people against the movement. I don't think it's effective, but let's not pretend that past movements have never made demands before everyone was ready. Because there never has been, and there never will be a time when everyone is ready.
And she's saying, you cannot discredit a whole movement just because it has a militant wing. But yet again, this is not a view that we stated in the podcast. In fact, in episode 6, I believe it was, you talk about the fact that people who were against the Westboro Church tried to burn down your house and burn down your church.
Mm-hmm.
People sent you death threats. And that only made you double down on your position.
But it didn't make them wrong.
Yes, it didn't make them wrong.
In their general position.
I don't think that it is good or right to try and burn somebody's house down like they did yours. But I'm saying that it didn't make their side of this moral argument wrong. And suddenly your church's side of this moral argument right.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, though, like, Natalie says that, but then she also backs off of that. You know, she says, and I'm not trying to justify that. I think, you know, we should persuade people. I'm not trying to justify terrorism. So it's I don't know. It's a little...
It's muddy.
Yeah. It's really not engaging with what we actually believe.
Right.
I think.
I do think, though, that what she's trying to say is, I don't stand for violence. I don't want J.K. Rowling's house to be burned down, but she does think that an effective tool for trans liberation is attempting to make people who have views like J.K. Rowling's too afraid to say them in public.
Too afraid or too ashamed?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Well, this is the point that Michelle Goldberg was making in the series at the end of episode 4. She said that the seeds of the backlash are contained in the effort to suppress the conversation. And again, I think this is another reason why it seemed so important for us to make the show, which is that the views espoused by J.K. Rowling are actually quite mainstream.
Yeah.
And they have to be wrestled with in public, I think. If you think that they're wrong, You have to persuade people of that. And even if you're effective in finding a way of shutting down the conversation, if it's ultimately to your own detriment and to the detriment of the movement that you are trying to further, I mean, I don't think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that we should go now to just one last criticism from Natalie Wynn.
The most frustrating thing about this podcast is that it refuses to be honest about what it is. They spend 7 hours implying that J.K. Rowling is the victim of a witch hunt in the most heavy-handed way imaginable. I've listened to the whole podcast now, and I truly do not think that anyone with basic media comprehension skills could come away from this thinking that the main intent was anything other than to portray J.K. Rowling as the martyr of an unjust, what's the word? Witch hunt?
Her accusation is that anyone who listened to this podcast could tell that you and I secretly thought that Rowling was right, and we just wanted to repair her public reputation, and that it was essentially dishonest of us to pretend otherwise.
I just find this a slippery and dishonest way to argue. If you believe that J.K. Rowling is the misunderstood victim of a witch hunt, then just say that. Make the argument you want to make. Don't crouch and hide behind this disavowal, this obfuscating veil of just asking questions.
And actually, I want to take the first stab at responding to this because while I absolutely refute her larger point, and we'll get to that, I do think that she is right to sense that you and I, we do not dislike J.K. Rowling.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't surprised to find that out. I have found that in my career, it's hard for me to spend a large amount of time with someone to pay close attention to their life story and not at the end of that come away with a deeper sense of empathy for them. And oftentimes with that does come some level of affection. And that was true of our time with Rowling.
Yeah, but the same is true for Natalie.
Exactly. You know, even as I watch her spend 2 hours in this video attacking our work, I have developed a deep sense of empathy for her. And yes, quite a bit of affection for her as well as a person.
Yeah, I mean, and there's just this conflation of, you know, the idea that liking someone or even loving someone, being fond of someone, enjoying spending time with someone is the same thing as endorsing all of their opinions or, you know, I just don't agree with that.
Right, totally. And, you know, to Natalie's larger point, that the only thing that anyone with even a little bit of media savvy could take away from our series is that you and I were just there to kind of sneakily repair Rowling's public reputation or defend all of her views. It's just simply not true. I mean, you and I are in a good position to say that because we made the show, we understand our intent, but it's also something that we've heard from literally thousands of people who came away from the show with a diverse set of views and experiences from listening to it. And I don't think it's invalid that Natalie had this view. I bet it's true that she did. But I just don't think that that claim matches up with the massive amount of feedback that we've gotten.
Yeah. And there was also this moment in the video where Natalie points to the very end of our series, you know, this last line from J.K. Rowling.
The final episode concludes with this.
There are more important things in this world than being popular. And that doesn't mean it's more important to me to be right. It means it's more important to me to do the right thing.
And says, why would you end on that note?
Why would you end on that note if Megan didn't fundamentally believe that J.K. Rowling is in the right?
Megan must fundamentally believe that J.K. Rowling is right. There is no other reasonable way to interpret this. And I just really found myself shaking my head at that because, you know, in context, you know, J.K. Rowling is saying she's trying to do the right thing. And we just heard from, you know, members of Westboro Baptist Church and literal witch hunters saying that they were trying to do the right thing.
Right.
And so this idea that Natalie presents as, you know, no reasonable person could disagree with my take is just wild to me, especially because we heard from thousands of people. Some people started the series as fans of Rowling and ended the series as fans of Rowling. Some started as fans and ended as like, oh my God, wow, like she's a total transphobe. Like
there was every kind of person. There were those who thought that Rowling was a transphobe. They heard the show. They got a more nuanced view of her.
Yeah.
There was just this wide spectrum of responses to Rowling herself.
And the funny thing is, so many people wrote to us to say, wow, I got to the end of that series and I realized I have no idea what you actually believe about the issues. And I'm so glad.
Right.
And thank you for that. I want more journalism like this. I want people to tell me what has happened. What are people saying? What are the arguments? Without trying to tell me what to think.
Right. I do think we have a bias, and that bias is towards humanizing people, even people who we may or may not strongly disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that that is at odds with a lot that's happening in the public conversation as of late, although, like we said, I do see signs that that could change.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, it's just not been at the forefront of a lot of journalism and journalistic endeavors in recent years. However, with all that said, this means, though, that we are going to treat Natalie and this video in the exact same way.
Yeah.
I disagree with her, and yet I am eternally glad that she spoke with us. It was a really amazing interview.
Mm-hmm. She added so much to the series. I'm so grateful, too. Yeah, I mean, I think her contribution to the show and the way that she very elegantly articulated her position, I think she reached an awful lot of people, and I'm really, really grateful that she was willing to talk.
Me too. And I'm grateful that she is putting her views out there in public, even if I disagree with them. And finally, to conclude this look back and our attempt to understand the state of this difficult debate, we checked back in with Noah.
I think that it came across, I've been told by other people actually, that I came across very hopeful in my original interview. And I think that is accurate and fair as to how I was feeling.
Noah grew up a massive Harry Potter fan. He was 13 years old when he began his gender transition. And in our conversation for the show, he walked us through in detail both the treatment process that he went through and how he felt at each stage of it, from puberty blockers to testosterone to surgery at age 16. And Noah's perspective as a minor receiving this hotly debated care was something that many listeners said was their favorite aspect of our series.
Noah, do you see signs that we as a society are right now growing more open to having good faith debates in public, even when those debates are really hard?
Yes, I do. My first political memory is the Trump campaign. That happened when I was just leaving elementary school, because at the time I was a young girl in the world and I was especially distressed by that tape, grab him by the pussy. I leaned on my mom for support, and one of the things she said to me is that politics are a pendulum, and it swings one way and then it swings back the other way. And then the next time it swings a little less far in that direction. And I certainly saw that. I remember in 2016, 2017 roughly, it didn't feel like there was a safe place to have a marginalized identity. It felt like things were sort of crumbling, and many people's lives became very difficult for many reasons in those years who were already marginalized. But then, there was this really strong conception in culture that came really hard that we as a country don't stand for that sort of thing and we should advance marginalized voices. And that took off and it went way past the people that it originally was trying to help. And that led to some people feeling, it's gone too far in the other direction. Mm-hmm. The public conversation, I think, has, swung both ways recently in terms of who it favors and who it's more difficult for. And I'm a very idealistic person, I'm barely an adult, but I do think that conversations are getting easier, and they're probably going to get harder again, and then they're probably going to get easier again. And it's just another example of the pendulum. But I think overall, I firmly believe that in the long term, there are enough people who genuinely want compassionate and thoughtful conversation that there's no other way that the world could move.
Are you glad that you participated in the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling? Like, just how do you feel about it?
In regards to whether or not I'm glad I did it, that's an undeniable, unquestionable yes, absolutely I'm glad. Because I was frankly really delighted. I had been met with a lot of empathy, and I did feel much more hopeful about the whole world and like the country, because all of the people who listened, I'm just so grateful. I can't believe how many people, I mean, I can believe because the production value is very high, and, you know, it's a very well-structured.
We're keeping this part in, guys.
I think I now see, maybe past Rowling, to a much larger body of people who have each in a unique way shown compassion and shown curiosity. And I have hope for every single person who listened to all 7-ish hours of the podcast. Even the people who will say to me, like, you know, you don't know what you're doing, or you've made a mistake, or you're one in a million, and most people are more likely to make mistakes, or, you know, there's other people who do regret their transitions. Even those voices, which I find personally frustrating at times, I can tell that all of the people who say things like that, they're coming from typically a genuine fear and consideration for especially children. It's sort of the soft spot that human beings have, which runs through this entire issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so glad that I was given this opportunity. So glad to have been a part of it. And in terms of a little bit more outside of me, I really can't help but feel like it was a net good, because I just think that if your values are compassion and empathy and thoughtfulness, you can and should disagree on the details. In fact, that's the best case scenario, that we disagree on the best ways to make other people feel protected and taken care of, and that their safety is assured. If those truly are your values, I really think that the more we espouse values like that, the better the world becomes.
We ended our interview last time asking you what you would say to Rowling, and you were hopeful that this would be a blip on her legacy, and that maybe there would be a open dialogue where she wouldn't abandon all of her concerns and original beliefs, but where a sort of peace could reign. Do you still feel hopeful that could happen? And what would you say to her now?
I feel hopeful about everything. But I think that maybe a blip on someone's legacy is less interesting to me now than, you know, in 5 years, in 10 years, rather than looking back and saying, was this a blip on her legacy? Maybe we can say, who is this person as a whole? What can they teach us? I think we have gained so much as a society from this conversation, and she's a part of that. And I guess what I would say to J.K. Rowling is that I recognize her humanity in all of the ways that manifests. And I guess I would say that there's nothing that she could say that would make me forget who she is. And that's another human being. And I hope that there's nothing that I could say that would make her feel similarly about me.
How old are you now? Just remind our listeners how old you are.
I am going to turn 19 soon, so
yeah,
very exciting.
I think you are wise beyond your years in many ways.
Thank you.
This episode of Reflector was produced by Andy Mills and me, Matt Bull, with help from Megan Phelps-Roper. Special thanks to Helen Lewis, Jacob Tobia, Natalie Wynn, Noah and his dad Jay, Anna Morkin, and to the team at the Free Press. To learn more about them, check out thefp.com. If you are new to our show, welcome. Please go check out our other episodes, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned for more stories, including one coming out soon where we debate and discuss a host of thorny topics with the wise and thoughtful rapper Killer Mike. If you'd like to support our work and ensure that we can keep this sort of journalism alive and well, please become a paid subscriber by following the link in the show notes or visiting us at reflector.show. Email us your feedback, your story suggestions, and criticisms to hello@reflector.show. And as always, thank you for listening. And we'll see you soon.